the Thomson Foundation has put together 3 really excellent training courses aimed at helping local journalists to improve their approach to environmental reporting. All of these courses are freely available online, and if you check out the Third Pole's Twitter page, our pinned tweet, you can check out these courses for yourself. So Catherine, it'd be great if you could give us a brief overview of these courses and how you think they can help journalists to cover some of the most important environmental issues facing us today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lizzie. Yeah, there are 3 courses, as you say. Before I go into more detail, really about what's in each course, I'll just give you a brief overview of them. But I think it's important to recognise their overall aim, because they're called environmental journalism, why local matters. And local, I think, is the key here. They're aimed at any journalist, ideally a generalist who isn't necessarily an environmental specialist. And the courses try to get them to be open to the idea, firstly, that there's no environmental story. Whatever's happening where you live is probably happening elsewhere. So the courses guide you really on being able to spot those links from local to national. The second aim is to get journalists to start seeing the bigger picture in whatever story they're covering. I mean, for example, you might be asked to cover a sport, health or education story. I know when I was just in a newsroom as a general reporter, I could be covering all of those just in one week. Just don't stick with that brief. Always ask yourself, what's the environmental link? So the courses, I think, guide people through that idea. It's really about giving your audience the whole story and changing the whole narrative, I think, with environmental stories. There was a time when, if you were an environmental journalist in a newsroom, you were sort of stuck in the corner. It was a really siloed beat. And I think the world has changed. Going back to what you said about the environmental issues facing us today, well, the environment and climate change are now top of the agenda. And I don't think any newsroom or journalist can afford to ignore that. You've got a duty, firstly, to serve and inform your audience. And I think, crucially, understanding that will actually help you be a better journalist and make your stories go further. So just briefly going over the 3 courses that we've got on our website, thomsonfoundation.org. They're free, by the way. There's 3 of them. There's sources, storytelling and safety. And there's lots of interactive elements. We're not lecturing people. There are quizzes, exercises and polls, really just to get journalists think more about the environment. So course 1, sources, will give you the practical skills needed to investigate your local environmental stories and really recognise if and how they're linked to climate change. I hope really in this first course we're taking away the fear really of climate science and all the jargon that comes with it. In the second course on storytelling, well, we all know we're heading towards the COP26 summit. Yes, it's incredibly important, but from an audience point of view, be honest, because it's probably going to be quite dull. We're going to hear a lot of politicians and a lot of scientists using a lot of jargon. So how do you, as a local journalist, make that global narrative interesting, relevant and engaging to your audience at that local level? So we've got lots of guidance and advice on key storytelling techniques to help you with that. And the third course is around safety. I'm sorry to say that environmental reporting is now considered one of the most dangerous beats for a journalist. Depending on where you are, it can be life-threatening. So we'll look at digital and physical threats and also danger from natural disasters. And we've got practical personal safety guides, how to do a risk assessment, for example, how to go about digital security. So going back to your question, environmental issues now really impact all corners of a newsroom. And hopefully with these courses, journalists will come to recognise that and appreciate the role that they have to play.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Catherine. Those courses are actually really fantastic. I was having a look at them.
That's very kind. Thank you.
It's really exciting and it's great that they're free and available to everybody. So yeah, once again, those can be found on our Twitter profile. If you click on the first tweet that's pinned, just under that is the link to those courses. I think Omair's having a few problems becoming a speaker. So this question is perhaps directed at Lou and Catherine, and hopefully Omair can join back in once those have been sorted. So aside from just these courses, what is your advice for journalists who would like to incorporate environmental reporting into stories on other topics? So as Catherine just mentioned, environmental issues do impact on all aspects of our lives today, from politics and economics to sport and fashion. And I know at the Third Pole, we've done quite a lot of pieces which do incorporate the environmental element into a range of other topics. So it would be great to hear from Lou, particularly on your advice, maybe thinking about it from a South Asia angle as well.
Yeah. I think I really love to hear from Catherine. Like, she opened with this idea that, the environmental angle is everywhere. And for me, I focus particularly on climate change. And that's the advice I always give whenever, a young reporter approaches me and asks, how do you find climate stories? that's always the same advice. Like every story is an environmental story, every story is a climate story, particularly now. And now, the beat and the subject is becoming a bit more mainstream. More people ask new questions, and we are faced with new environmental crisis. So it's even more important to recognize that every type of story, a general story about sports, as we were saying, about the financial world or social problems, there's always an environmental angle to that. And I would say with, South Asia in mind as well, but everywhere really, there's also always an inequality angle for me. That is something that, I think about whenever approaching a climate story, an environmental story, is also to look at that aspect, because we have a lot of, from COP, for example, is, as Catherine said, it's going to be quite dull, and there will be a lot of, climate diplomacy lingo and a lot of that. And, not many people will really be bothered listening, or even will be given the tools to really understand what's going on. So very often this has been going on for many years, and, people that don't routinely work in this field feel quite attached. They maybe hear something in the news, but, it's not easy to really connect with what's going on. But if you think that these big decisions will end up having an impact, a direct impact on people, and especially on vulnerable people that do not have a say, that puts everything into a different perspective to me. And for me as a journalist, it really gives me the motivation to pursue these stories, and also to make these stories accessible to as many people as possible. Actually, there was a piece of news, I think this morning, that I saw on Twitter, and there has been a lot of discussion on how to include delegates from developing countries now in these Corona times, allowing them to travel to COP. And there is also some logistic challenges related to the vaccines, related to accommodation and everything. And today's news was that the UK will not consider people from a number of developing countries vaccinated, even if they are, because there would be bureaucratic problems, probably with their certificates. This will mean that a lot of people will have to quarantine, and will have probably they will need to pay for hotels. They will need to pay for expensive tests, because the tests in the UK are very expensive. So this is yet another barrier, a very clear one, that is put against people from the developing country and people, that would have an important say. So it's just a small thing that happened today, but to me, it really encompasses one of the big issues that we have been tackling for many, many years, but we are really very far from solving.
That's great. Thank you, Lou. I think speaking about the inequality angle is so important, because climate change will affect all of us, but obviously it is already having much bigger impact on some areas of the world and some communities. And in order to get as many journalists from those communities themselves to be able to report on this topic, I think is a really worthwhile aim. Omair, I don't know if you were able to hear the question, but I just asked Lou about how your advice for how journalists can incorporate the environmental aspect into stories on other topics. So I didn't know if you had anything to contribute to that.
Yeah, well, I think we should go back to the nuts and bolts of what journalism is supposed to be about. Journalism is basically there to inform people so they can make better choices, right? And one of the biggest problems when we report on things like climate change and the environment is that they seem to be issues out there. They need to be connected to the political economy of what's going to affect people. And that really is the big challenge, because it isn't that the environment is out there. We live in it, right? We experience it. And the disasters that we've seen make that much more obvious. Not just that, it's that the choices that countries make about how they structure the economy makes a huge difference about what opportunities are available and which pathways we're going to go to. So pretty much, I mean, what the challenge right now in that sense is not so much whether environmental journalism is a separate field, but how journalism has in fact failed to incorporate many of the key questions of political economy, which will allow us to ask very simple questions, as in, like in India, why are we having coal auctions? Why are we at the same time investing in natural gas for cooking while building up an electric cooking subgrid? Are we doing competing designs? These are questions of money, of power, of politics. And if we do not address them in that way, And this is one of the things which I found really nice about the Thomson Foundation courses, is because it makes those connections both in what is local, how you do the storytelling on this, and how you approach these issues. And I think that's one of the things that we have to keep coming back to. This is journalism. What is journalism about? It's to better inform people about what is happening, why they're experiencing the particular things, who is making those decisions, and what impact those decisions are happening on their life.
Catherine, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I did. I think Omar's, he's really hit the nail on the head, because journalism is all about asking questions. You can get any story anywhere in the world just by asking 3 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What's next? I would say to journalists now, change your mindset and add a 4th question to that. What's the environmental link? Because there will be one. We talked about sport earlier. The Guardian had a story about a local cricket pitch which was closing because the ground was too dry and hard to play on. Well, that's the story. But why is it happening? A little bit of investigation revealed it's happening in many other towns, cities and countries, and it appears to be linked to climate change. So if you're a cricket fan, you might not be able to go and see your team every Saturday next season. When we start as journalists to show the impact to people on everyday lives, that's when we'll start to make a difference to people's mindsets.
Great, thank you all. So one final question from me before we move on to the Q&A section. So as we've discussed, the Thomson Foundation provides a lot of really great resources to help journalists improve their reporting on environmental issues. But it'd be really interesting here, from your personal experiences, do you have any particular pieces of advice, maybe something a little bit more practical rather than the big picture stuff we've been discussing so far, for journalists wanting to cover the environment on the ground? So perhaps we could talk about pitching your articles, or issues of safety, as Catherine mentioned earlier, or even the idea that climate change is not the only issue that's going on, even though that is perhaps the most reported issue. I don't know who wants to volunteer to go first.
I think Catherine. I'm volunteering.
Thanks very much for that. Yeah, my key piece of advice would be to start doing your homework. It's not a story that's going away. Yes, it can appear to be overwhelming. So my second top bit of advice is, don't be afraid to ask for help from experts. Even if all you do today is start following respected environmental journalists on social media and start reading some of their reports, you will have started on the right path. You can then start building up relationships with 1 or 2 scientists at a university. Have someone you can call on when you're given a story that seems incomprehensible because of the jargon used, and you'll start to learn a bit about climate change. You don't have to be a scientist. Just get to grips with some of the key bits of jargon. But just to end with, what I would say is, never ever sacrifice accuracy in favour of speed or style. It's better to be boring and accurate than colourful and libellous. But over time, as your confidence builds, aim to be colourful with your journalism and accurate, and that's how you will engage your audience in environmental stories.
Now, since I volunteered Catherine, I'll go second. This piece of advice I'm going to say is, always follow the money, right? And I mean, I'm saying this as an Indian journalist. I'm saying this for coming from a poor country. We have huge problems with poverty and challenges of that. No politician is ever going to ignore that. So when it comes to finding questions of livelihoods, of who's benefiting and who's losing out, these are your key questions that are the most important in the public domain, especially in poor countries, but not just in poor countries, in every country. So always remember, always try to find that. That's one of the key things which I always look for in a story pitch, as in, who's profiting, who's losing. Is it a short-term a solution that's benefiting a few people at the cost of a very large cost to the public or to other people? And the second piece of advice I'd make is, learn about the laws, right? If you know the laws, and ask as experts, please. There's a number of experts on this thing itself. I see Olga Kelkar here, and ask people. They'll explain to you what are the exact administrative legal challenges about why something is happening in the particular way it is happening. Don't assume. Ask. Always ask.
Right. I thought I'd jump in with my personal pet peeve. It's something that has become a bit of a trend in the past, I would say, few months in environmental journalism, and it is looking for colorful solutions to big problems. Many publications today are looking for these kind of stories. It's called solution journalism, which is a nice idea. And it means, we don't just want to report the doom and gloom, but we also want to explore, the way forward in the face of these problems. But very often it is really reduced to, quick fixes that look good and make for a good story and are uplifting. But in reality, they're just what they are, like quick fixes that don't work in the long run, or as Omair was saying, benefit only a few people at the expenses of many more people. So I would say always approach the solution approach with a healthy dose of skepticism. And, if there's somebody pitching you, maybe a PR person offering you, nice story about a good solution for this or that, or a new scientific paper, always put it to enough independent experts until you find someone that will point out potential flaws or potential caveats that. And this is not something that I would say could be a problem for reporters on the ground, but I see also affects big editors that I can read on Twitter every day, and they will say stuff like, "Oh, it'd be so easy to get rid of coal. We could electrify everything. We could put electric cars on the streets, and we will be rid of coal very quickly, and that's within our grasp." Obviously, the reality is not that simple. Like, there are countries that can position right now to electrify everything, but most countries, including and the vast majority of the developing world, are not in the position to do that. And it's not a matter of they don't want to; they just cannot, because there are economic problems and infrastructural problems and legal issues as well. So I think, this is a good perspective to keep in mind when approaching a story, like putting electric cars on the streets, getting rid of fossil fuels is not as easy as it seems. And when somebody pitches you an easy solution, there's normally something going on behind.
Can I just pick up on that? Sorry, it's Catherine. Just I think you're absolutely spot on with that, because that's something we address in the course with Clue, Clean Energy Wire, who are specialists based in Germany, who look at solutions for climate change. And the job of a journalist isn't to make the audience feel good. It's to inform and empower them. And as you rightly say, when it comes to solutions, they have to be science-based and evidence-based, not just a quick grabby headline.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. That was a really interesting discussion. So now I think we could move on to the Q&A with the audience. So if any audience members have a question or even a comment on something that's been said and would like to share it, please request to speak, and I can unmute you and call on you to ask your question. If for whatever technical reason that isn't working, feel free to tweet your question to @third_poll, and I'll read it out for you. So we'll give it a few minutes. I know people sometimes takes a while to figure out how to do it. Okay, so it doesn't look like anyone's got a question at the moment. If you do think of one, please request to speak and I will unmute you. So I thought it might be interesting. Oh, okay, we have a question from Rajesh. Let me just add you as a speaker. Okay, just connecting. Hi, you should be able to speak now. Oh, you just unmuted yourself. Let me unmute you. Sorry, Twitter's. Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, since nobody was volunteering, I thought let me share a few thoughts that I have. I think both Omair and Catherine talked about how a journalist's job is to provide audience and readers with information. I think the other important thing that we keep talking about, it is about giving information in a context. Information and context. Without context, the information has very little meaning. And I just wanted to kind of tell to one fact that happening in India. Every year, we have cyclones, floodings, and the intensity and frequency of these are increasing by the year, thanks to climate change. Yet, if you look at the reportages that happens around these things, very rarely we try to put the broader context, which is climate change. And a lot of reportage is about the damage, destruction, losses, compensations, people, but the broader question of climate change rarely kind of gets into the copies or gets into the coverage of these incidents. So it's not about the environment reporter covering these things. In most cases, you'll have every reporter covering these, and how do you kind of sensitize the reporters? And if the reporters were doing the job of being a good journalist, simply that you always look for the context, then probably the climate change things would come up. The other aspect is, being a good journalist is always to ask, why should I report on this? The so what. Now, in the run up to the COP, I have seen there has been a tremendous push in India with journalists writing about electric vehicles and everything that's around electric vehicles. And in the past 6 months, rarely have I seen a concerted effort for people to actually talk about public transportation. You know, uh, different countries are at a different stage of development, and as I think Catherine or Lou said, that electric vehicles, that may not necessarily be the solution for many countries. There could be better solutions, better alternatives. It is not so easy to make a switch from fossil fuels. In India, for the last 3 decades, we have been pushing private vehicles. We have been, every time the automobile industry sees a slump in demand, we have columns and columns in newspapers and airtime on television channels being uh, devoted to how we can correct the situation. But rarely we talk about public transportation. And barring one or two cities where public transportation has picked up, and Delhi NCR is the Delhi National Capital Region of Delhi is a very good example of how coming up with a metro has changed a lot of things here. A lot more needs to be changed, but a lot, it would have been even more. It would have been worse if had the metro not come up the way it came up. But why is it that none of the other Indian cities have done that? Because we don't talk about it. So there is not, there are elements. There is not. I think 80% of what it takes to be a good environment journalist is the same as what it takes to be a good journalist. So a good journalist has to place the information in the right context, look for the context, and good journalists to always ask questions, and the right questions, and not just go by what kind of comes to be an attempt to push a dominant discourse, or just simply lift what has been happening elsewhere in the world. You have different geographies, different cultures, different societies. The problems are very different. The solutions are very different. Thank you. I think that's where the gap lies. If I have to talk about the Indian context and environmental reporting in the Indian context. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Omair, Lou, Catherine, I don't know if any of you have any comments.
I just wanted to say I really agree with the observation that, to be a good environmental journalist, you basically need the same things you need to be a good journalist in general. It's just maybe how you look at things, but the skills you need are pretty much the same. So I agree with that.
I'll just come in there. I was going to pick up on what you said about context, because he was absolutely spot on. I don't know what the solutions are to this. I think newsrooms around the world are pretty stretched. The urgency is to get the story and get the story out as quickly as possible. So if you've got a cyclone, you're telling today's story and you might have to tell it in 250, 300 words. I don't know what the solution to it is, other than to start changing people's mindsets and to get people thinking about that bigger picture.
I'd like to say one other thing about the context. I remember I was working at the British High Commission, and one of my colleagues came up to me and was trying to understand this advice that they'd gotten on environment stuff. This was 10, 15 years ago, 15 years ago almost. And it said, consider using a shower to save water. And it took us a little while to figure out that it meant instead of a bathtub, which was ridiculous given, in India, you'd use one bucket of water, which saves a lot more water than a shower, right? That's how most people take a bath. So there is this huge thing about the fact that sometimes when you follow global trends, they have absolutely no meaning in local context. And so be careful and try to explain what exactly something is. it's good to understand what's happening. I mean, it's good to understand what's happening with around the world, but there's nothing that's international. Everything like politics, all journalism is local and specific.
Great, thank you. I think our next question comes from Afia. You've already been promoted to speaker. If you
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Hi. Thank you so much for this conversation, which is something very, very important that should have been taking place much earlier on different forums. So, like Catherine mentioned, I think you were the one who mentioned it first. It's also very important to see what is happening in the context of the inequalities and the vaccine apartheid. The word has been used now. People have come out and said it is a huge problem because the global South actually is one of the has been cited as the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, and yet it is global South which will not have its voice as stridently, present at the COP, at the international forums, simply because of the restrictions on the kind of the vaccines that have been available to these countries. And this is a huge problem. And I think this is something that people, not just from the global South, need to speak about, but also elsewhere, all those people who believe in, equality and justice. And in the context of climate change, because climate change also exacerbates the inequities that are already there, the inequities of the solutions, the resources, the different level of impacts. So that is something that the journalists have not yet focused on. And I think this is also something, because it is something new, and COVID is being seen in a different context. So the journalists who are actually trying to be environmental and climate change journalists, I totally agree with Omair that they have to be journalists first. And these days, there is nothing that is only climate change journalism, because poverty is related to it. And if you look at it under the umbrella of the SDGs, which most of the world countries have signed up on, so we need reporters, we need editors who are cognizant of this importance of looking at it in in not just as a standalone topic. And this is why I think we need to also focus our attention, especially the training courses. And here I would like to mention the courses that are crafted by Thomson. Most courses focus on the capacity building of reporters, and far too few focus on the sensitization of the gatekeepers, like the stories that need to be assigned to the reporters, the stories that need to be accepted into the newsroom if a reporter has gone out and done something beyond the call of his assigned duty. And I think not as many people in the newsrooms are actually understanding what an important and connected topic climate change is to all, to business, to, you very rightly mentioned, sports. I mean, cricket was the reason for my being when I started my career. And other than what you have mentioned, the climate change and the weather pattern changes and the shifting monsoons that we are experiencing in the subcontinent have actually resulted in the postponement of some mega events. Now, they are not just sports events. Everything is linked to that. Livelihood, there's lots of money that goes down the drain if such events are cancelled. So they also have to do their forward planning, to be responsive to these kind of changes. So there are so many topics out there, and too few people are actually picking up the nuances that can be sensed in topics connected to climate change. So I think the editorial leaders in the newsrooms, I think they also need some kind of capacity building. I'll stop here.
Thank you. It might be interesting to have a quick response from Omair or Lou as part of our editorial team. Would you agree that editorial teams also need this kind of training and upskilling?
Yes, I completely agree. And particularly now, because climate change and environment are becoming more and more mainstream, I see a lot of mainstream outlets, especially like from what I see in the West, they're ramping up their editorial capacity in-house, and they're assigning a lot of general editors that don't have that expertise to covering climate change and commissioning climate change environment stories. And while this is obviously great, I feel there is a need of having at least one team member in the newsroom that has that expertise and that can listen to reporters when they pitch a good story, or be able to select which stories are good and which stories are maybe headline grabbing, but they're not very they're not very meaningful. So I think this is very, very important, and it will become more important going forward as newsrooms expand their climate and environment capacity.
Great, thank you, Lou. We have quite a lot of people requesting to speak and a few tweets that have been sent to us on Twitter. So if I could ask everyone if they could make their comments and questions nice and concise, that would be great, just so we have time to get to everybody. Roxy, I think you were next to speak.
Yeah, thanks for this wonderful discussion. I'm a climate scientist, I'm not a journalist. And I'm the person that work on changing cyclones, shifting monsoons and all. So for you guys, I would like to point out a challenge where journalists and scientists can in fact work together. So scientists are reluctant, oftentimes you could see that they are reluctant to, discuss the science that they do. And one of the reasons is many of these institutions, I work in a government institution, and we have several rules and, several things to cover before disseminating the science that we do. So institutions often, it's not just government institutions, but also universities stop scientists and professors from disseminating the science that they do instead of encouraging that dissemination. So we might be missing several important aspects of environment or climate change, because these are all sensitive issues when you are covering it, unlike the other aspects. So you might be missing several important aspects or covering only one side of the story. And this, in fact, I have been several times stopped from disseminating science. And this is a science I have already published in peer-reviewed journals. And we need to work on this reluctance from the scientific institutions and government bodies, which are in fact publicly funded, which is based on publicly funded data. And the science is already published, just that you need to get into, convert into layman's term through a journalist and publish through media. So this is somewhere, I guess, I think this has to be brought to the limelight if you want to cover environment and climate change much more in a better way. And we need the journalists and scientists to work together on that. That's all.
I can come in on that. I don't think you're alone as a climate scientist in thinking that you're not allowed to speak to journalists. I've been a journalist for 30 years, and I've seen this happen more and more across all public bodies. 30 years ago, I could ring up anyone and have a conversation, and there was that element of trust that whatever they told me, I wasn't immediately going to go and report it, but I was using them for background. There seems to have been a lack of trust building up amongst journalists and public bodies, whether it coincides with the increase in social media, who knows. I think it's brilliant as a climate scientist, though, you want to have a better relationship with journalists. And I think that's something really that individual journalists should pursue. But I think it's for the industry as a whole. We need to look at how we can start building up that sort of trust with people like you, with climate scientists who know what they're talking about, so we can tell the story properly.
Can I just jump in there for a second? I think primarily one of the reasons why it's become a more contentious issue is because actually now climate has finally become something on the political agenda. And that means power and money are affected. And for a lot of scientists, generally do not want to get involved in the politics, because that means that they're going to get attacked by politicians, or they're going to possibly have responses that are that challenge something as core as their funding. And they don't want research to be cast doubt on for petty political reasons. Unfortunately, petty political reasons is why journalism is kind of done, to expose exactly why we are where we are, so people can change things. And so I don't think that there's an easy solution to this. I think it's incredibly important for journalists to respect their sources, to run the copies by people that they have spoken by, and make sure that they're commenting properly, and not to run, just be good journalists. But I think one of the things it's great, Roxy, that you're willing to talk, and I know that there are lots of scientists who are frustrated with what they perceive as their difficulty to speak to journalists and choose not to. But I think it's actually just going to get more and more difficult for climate scientists to stay out of the political fracas. And that leaves us with a much more challenging situation going forward. because everyone's just going to get hit because this now involves big money.
Great, thank you for that discussion. Just moving on quickly to the next question. This is one that was submitted via Twitter. Do you think there are any differences in approaches towards environmental issues if you're an editor looking at it from a Western perspective compared to a journalist from an Asian region?
Lou, you're in the middle there.
I am in the middle. I think they shouldn't be, but they are, and it ties with what I was saying before. Like a lot of journalists in the West really take what can be only described as a westernized perspective to climate change. So even the debate about, what can you do as an individual to reduce your carbon footprint is great. But if you think about it, it's a very Western perspective because, changing behaviors will not change the system. And we can see it in developing countries. Individual carbon footprint is tiny. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of the carbon footprint of someone in the West. And yet, these are countries that have lots of emissions and have a system that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So I think this is just one example of how, the climate issue can be interpreted in a different way in the West and in places like Asia, South Asia. So yeah, I think it would be good for all editors to always keep in mind the perspective of the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable communities, and what their view must be, not just the fact that they are at risk, but what the perspective might be. So it should really be every time, for every single story, trying to take this global perspective, starting from the developing world, and then see, where does this leave rich countries and what can they do to tackle this.
Great.
I think,
Omair, did you want to jump in?
yeah, I think there's a little bit more complexity in that as well that we should also explore. When we say who's the most vulnerable, even in developing countries, some people are far less vulnerable than others.
Oh yeah,
And
definitely.
some people are emitting far more than others, right? So that's a debate but that compared to, developing countries and developed countries, the comparison is very different. I think largely, journalism is the exploration of power, how power works. And one of the things that is very true of the climate crisis is that the world has become comfortable living with a system that's destroying the world. And we need to actually examine, where the nuts and bolts of that are. We have to ask those difficult, uncomfortable questions. And again, it's very in different countries that will mean different questions. So I don't think that there's an okay, look, we get funded by people like the Earth Journalism Network, right? But the lovely thing about something like that, which is an international grant, is that they're still asking for very local stories, because that's actually what will resonate on the large terms.
Great, thank you, Lou and Omair. We've got quite a lot of questions still. I think originally this was scheduled to be 45 minutes, which we've just reached, but I'm happy to continue the space for a little while longer so we can try and get some more questions. But Omair, Lou and Catherine, if you do need to drop off, please feel free, and thank you for participating. Apologies with my pronunciation, but Shivangi, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks. It's Shivangi, and I'm not a journalist, but I am a reader, and I've been reading climate journalism since I was a kid, actually. And thank you for organizing this. Climate journalism is in many ways also activism, because I think, like a lot of people have said, that this isn't this like Omair, you just said that this is something that people have gotten comfortable living with, and we have to mobilize people to realize, like, basically the world is being destroyed. And part of that is essentially, for lack of a better word, shaming companies and governments into kind of change, because when one exposes them, then it forces them to change. And a lot of the work that has been done is down to kind of journalists covering these, and things like cyclones and oil spills obviously get covered in mainstream media, but at least, and maybe I have got it wrong, but to me, before the recent IPCC report, this was kind of not mainstream. And if I draw parallel to, let's say, tech journalism, which in like the 2000s used to be again kind of niche, but now has become really mainstream and is causing big companies like Facebook and others to change their policies, or at least reflect or respond to kind of growing public outcry against it. How can I mean, maybe it's not even the journalist's job to make it more mainstream. Maybe it's kind of a collective role, but I think a lot of it will happen if it's, if, let's say, the financial newspapers or mainstream digital media starts featuring this as their headline story day after day, and not just when a report comes out or when a hurricane happens or a cyclone happens or an oil spill happens, because this is happening every single minute. And the second thing is about kind of citizen journalism, because any change will only happen when citizens start to engage. And I think a lot of people don't realize how in our face this whole thing is. Like, I still find it very perplexing, and I'm vexed about it, that 20 million people who live in Delhi have no issues with living in one of the most polluted cities from October to March, where you can't breathe, and people just seem to be living with it. So how can we kind of get them to get us, citizens, to kind of speak up and demand action from the government? So I want to know your views on the activism side of things, perhaps.
One of the Thomson Foundation courses addresses that particularly. So Catherine is the person to speak on that.
I was just about to pick up on that. Yeah, I mean, there's a very, very fine line between journalism and activism, and they should be kept apart. You're either a journalist or an activist. Doesn't mean you can't be sympathetic as a journalist, but really it's all about trust with your audience. If your audience know, or they can read your bias, they're not going to trust what you're telling them. So if you are going down that line, you need to declare your own interest in the story, if you have one, to your editor or your media outlet. You need to think about being fair to your interviewees. You might not like what they're saying, but you need to approach them in an ethical manner and be fair to them. And your language, no matter what the subject is or how strongly you feel about it, you can't reveal your own bias. You have to maintain your professional credibility. It's not easy. I'm really not saying it's not easy. And there are times when you will want to say something, and maybe you'll write an opinion piece, but then you have to clearly label it for your audience. This is an opinion piece. It's not a news article. So there is a line, and it does get blurred. And I think in the modern age, with like the Me Too movement, for example, for some young journalists, their activism is wrapped up in being a journalist. But I really think that you need to work incredibly hard to keep the two separate, to maintain your credibility, and more importantly, above all else, to maintain trust with your audience.
I'd add that there is a certain activism which is inherent in journalism.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right with that.
In the sense that there is journalism is against secrecy. It's against backroom deals. It's against hiding how power works, because the whole point of journalism is to explain how power works. Now, that is not the same thing as political activism. And that's really a hard, fine line to find and to keep. If you're an activist and you're a journalist, your activism happens outside your journalism. But both political activists as well as journalists are always interested in how power works and how the status quo is sustained. And that's where there is a resonance. And primarily what I was saying, Shivangi, is in that we have grown comfortable with living in a world where we're heading towards a certain kind of destruction, is that we as journalists can examine that power verification, why the carbon economy is so set in our system. But we're not activists to tell you, burn down the coal plants or whatever, I don't know.
I just wanted to jump in with a comment about, the fine line between journalism and activism when it comes to climate change, because I find we are right now in a changing landscape for the media everywhere, but particularly when it comes to climate change, we see a lot of organizations that are basically sponsored, or they stem from big activism groups like Greenpeace or others. And they do really good work. But I also do agree with what Kat's saying. Like, how do you place yourself as a journalist if you're doing an important investigation, or you're uncovering ground truth or something that people really should know and take seriously, but you work under the umbrella of an environmental group, an environmental activist group. I think it's a real dilemma that faces many journalists today. Many journalists would be hesitant to go for a job working with one of these big organizations because they feel their professional standing might be at stake and people might not take them as seriously. So I wonder if there is a middle space where activists are becoming and are interacting more with journalists. And this could be a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing or offer the opportunity to skeptics to say, here you're working with an agenda. So I don't know what the future is going to be, but I think it's something interesting that is happening now, and it's definitely evolving.
And to pick up on that, in the growing number of attacks on journalists covering environmental stories, you're getting people accusing them of being activists simply by virtue of the fact that they're covering a controversial environmental story. So they're getting accused with a label, you're an activist, we can't believe you, the audience shouldn't believe you. So you need to be able to show that you're not an activist, you're not linked to these organisations, and you're independent of them.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question that's just been submitted is, how do you get across environmental story pitches to editors who may not have significant interest in the topic or do not have a nuanced view on the same and are sometimes susceptible to greenwashing?
Wow, if you've got a bad editor, you're stuck.
Like for every story, right?
Yeah, that's for every story. I mean, generally, if you've got a bad editor, you're stuck. But if you want to pitch a story, journalism is about power, money, influence. Get on that.
I'd give them a reason to care. Just be clear in your own mind. The first three questions I always ask myself about a story, it's the same question. I repeat it. What's the story about? What's the story about? What's the story about? Sum it up in a sentence. Pretend you're ringing a friend, or actually ring a friend or your mum, whoever it is. What would you say to them when they ask, what's it about? Make them care. And that might be the beginning point of making your editor care. But like has already been said, if you've got a bad editor, you are a bit stuffed.
Just go to someone else. Is the advantage of being freelancer is that you can move on to a different client. But I do agree. My advice, and like from my experience as a freelancer, I was freelancing for many years, is always to put at the very top why the story matters, and then explain the nuts and bolts of the story you want to tell. But I think this applies to any editor, even someone who is very interested in climate change. They will be thinking about their readers. So for any editor, it's also important to know how the story would engage the readers and not just them as people who are really interested in the matter. So I think this applies to any pitch, not just for climate change, really.
Great, thank you. Ridwan, you've now been added as a speaker. You've been waiting very patiently.
Yes, finally. Thank you so much. My name is Ridwan Karim Dini Osman. I'm a broadcast journalist from Ghana. I think in reality, covering the environment, particularly climate change, is a challenge for a lot of reporters in Ghana. Because the brevity of news and the traditional expectation of media is that you cover conflict, the scandals, and all of that. But I've also realized that in recent times, a lot of young journalists are coming through the ranks and they are being more adventurous and creative about telling stories on the environment. And that is because we have international organizations like the Thomson Foundation and the others who are providing some sort of capacity building. But if you look at in-country and generally on the continent, capacity building, particularly in the area of environmental reporting, is not something that is being prioritized because media owners feel that stories on the environment are not commercially viable, and a lot of them are expensive to cover because the journalists would have to travel to the northern part of the country where people bear the worst brunt of climate change to tell those stories. And so a lot of the time, the journalists who even attempt to tell the climate stories don't know how to demystify the jargons. They don't know how to tell the stories with nuance and context. And so they just tell the story, and at the end of the day, it is just empty. So my question, and this is particularly to Catherine, how do we get media owners to realize that this is important? Like, we need to invest in capacity building for our journalists to be able to tell the best of stories. And briefly, I think one of the speakers also talked about approaching solution journalism with a healthy dose of skepticism. I want to find out, because we are told that we need to encourage community initiative. Because if, for instance, you go to an indigenous community and you realize that the people themselves have a way they are dealing with climate change, for instance, or an environmental issue, for instance, you feel the need to highlight, to encourage more of such initiatives. But I get your point that we also need to look at the sustainability of those initiatives as well. But my question is, how do we do both at the same time without making people who are at the forefront of such initiatives feel like they are not doing enough? Thank you very much.
I'll just pick up on the first part of that then, as you asked me to. I don't think there are any easy answers. I think someone earlier suggested training courses for editors. I'll be pitching that later on today, I think. I think from an editor's point of view, they're always going to be asking, what's in it for me? I mean, obviously, the obvious answer is that you're going to get new stories and you could potentially get a new audience. I know the International Federation of Journalists, because we've got them in the course, Par Louis Tomasi, who's the director in Africa. They've trained currently about 400 journalists on environmental story. I think overall, I think it's a two-pronged approach. I think journalists, not just in Africa, but in many parts of the world, reticent about tackling environmental stories. You said it yourself, there are technical concepts, there's confusion that put people off. And there's editors who have got an eye on their advertisers and their audience figures when it comes to pitching environmental stories. So I think it's a two-pronged attack. I think headway is being made, but I think actually we need to start. I think it's been said several times, you're right, we perhaps need to start looking at the other end of things, the top end of things where decisions are being made, and how we can start changing the mindset among those people. I don't think it's easy, and I haven't got a particular answer for you, I'm afraid.
If I may say one thing, Ridwan, I'm as comfortable, talking about Ghana, because I don't know enough about Ghana, I've never visited. But certainly where we see it in India, and we've seen this in other places as well, that power is often flows through water. So who gets to drink water? Who gets to drink clean water? The Flint water crisis in the US is a particularly good example of how marginalized communities pay the heaviest price when it comes to water. We have cases of attacks on minorities across South Asia who've been trying to access water. The anti-segregation struggles in the US, a lot of that was about segregated water supplies and stuff like that. So one of the key things when we're covering the climate is literally water, and water availability, water cleanliness, who gets it, who has to walk long miles for it, especially its impact on women. And so I would suggest that is water is a way of exploring power, which will be of essential interest to people covering conflict. It's a political story, it's an economy story, it's a society story.
I think you're absolutely right, Omar, but the Flint water crisis, it took 18 months for the national media in the States to pick up on that, because it was in a poor area and affecting people, and an issue that the editors didn't care about particularly. Yeah. And I wonder how we can just start changing that sort of mindset, really.
That's a question that's actually far beyond me to be able to.
And me, that's why I asked you, because I haven't got an answer to it, I'm afraid.
The French Revolution, the whole guillotines thing, I think maybe, but possibly not.
I also wanted to pick up on the last question, because it was a very good one, talking about local initiatives that could be pitched as solution stories. I think it's very important. I also briefly reported from Africa for a few months, and I remember there was a lot of community engagement, and very often communities like to feel they're making a difference. And I think it's very important to broadcast these stories because they are definitely part of the climate change conversation and progress everywhere. I think from a journalism perspective, a way to approach this, or a story that tells about a small project, something that is not going to make a global difference but can trigger change at a local level, is just really to put that into context. So maybe in a very simple, from a very practical perspective, just providing some global figures to give a sense of what the problem is and provide a perspective on, the real change that any given project might trigger over the long period. So making sure that the story of, a small case study is not told in isolation, but is told within the broader context and with obviously some balanced perspective. So there will be challenges, there will be things that the project cannot do, and there will be things that people need help with to grow whatever project they're carrying out. So yeah, I think these stories are definitely worth telling. So yeah, I wouldn't want people to take home this message that solution journalism is not worth pursuing. It's very important, it's a very powerful tool if done right.
Yeah, and I'd add that science and innovation is beautiful, and it makes for gorgeous stories.
True.
I mean,
Definitely.
it is the most inspiring. If you get it right, it is gorgeous. It is the best type of storytelling.